of Jewish Studies, Valley Beth Shalom. It's our custom to offer university-level learning without quizzes, no term papers, no fraternities, and no football team. Sorry. But a chance to just do some really good learning together. So if you'll indulge me for a moment, stand up if you would, turn around and say hello to the people that are sitting with you. We do this as a community. We should know each other. So say hi. Don't sit down yet. You're going to be sitting for a very long time. So you need to get a little blood circulating before you fall asleep. Good. And now if you'll join me in just a moment of prayer, there's a prayer for, just stay up, stay standing up. It's good for you. You're going to be sitting a long time, I promise you. This is better than Equinox. There's a bracha for learning and then a bracha for special moments, right? Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu, la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu v'kiyamanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh. Amen. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Thank you so much. Have a seat. A couple of quick acknowledgments. We are recording these sessions. We're not streaming them, so you have to actually show up. But if you miss one, or if you fell asleep in the middle and you want to catch up, we will record them, and sometime soon we'll put them up online, and they won't charge anything to watch them. So that's what that little yellow light, red light behind us is. I'd like to thank Alana Zimmerman, our program director, for her efforts in putting all this together. And Louise, are you still charged in cookies? Are you still the maven of cookies here? None anymore. Now Alana took that over, or the staff took that over. Anyway, thank you for whoever's brought us cookies. Maybe God. Thank you. Thank you for the cookies. This is going to be a 5-session class. We're going to meet through the month of November, but not the night before Thanksgiving. That's Yontif, and you should be home cooking a turkey. And then conclude the first week in December. The 4th of December will be our last session, and everyone's invited. And if you do have friends or family who are interested in these topics, we'd be delighted to have them come too. It's open to everyone in the community, and by a special agreement with Valley Beth Shalom, we don't charge anybody for this. So it's a wonderful opportunity to do some learning. I'm Rabbi Feinstein. I work here at VBS for a very long time, and I'll introduce our guest teacher in just a moment. So all of us have a sense, I think, all American Jews have a sense, that something has changed this year. That American Jewish life is different this year than it was a year or so ago. That October 7th and its aftermath has shifted American Jewish life, and perhaps there were antecedents of that in the few years before that, but something this year has really changed. With the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, with a sense that we're just not as at home in America as we're used to being. This was noticed, by the way, by numbers and numbers of scholars. There's a wonderful article by the journalist Franklin Foer in the Atlantic Monthly last year called "Is the American Jewish Century Ending?" And it caught my eye because it was such a startling recognition that something has changed. But there's really two recognitions here, and we have to gather both of them. First of all, that yes, something has changed in our lives, and we need to understand what has changed and how we cope with it. But more than that, we also need to understand what changed. What was it like before? Or that is, what has been altered? So this idea that the last 100 years or so, my ancestors came here between 1904 and 1914 with the big immigration from Eastern Europe. That in that century, in the century between 1914 and now, it's a century and 10 years, that something remarkable happened to Jews here in the United States, here in North America. And we'd like to understand that. Something remarkable happened to them. And I can just give you some indications of that, but really exploring the remarkable civilization, the remarkable cultural achievements of American Jewish life during this last century is what we're here to discuss. My ancestors came from villages in Eastern Europe. They were completely stranger when they got here. They came here not because they wanted to. There was nothing about apple pie and Chevrolet and baseball that brought them here. They were brought here because the pogroms made Jewish life in Eastern Europe impossible. And they came here because there was an opportunity, a possibility. They could not have dreamed of the life that I live. They simply could not have dreamed of the life that I live. The way in which I feel at home in America, the prosperity, the power, the security, the opportunity of American Jewish life. They could not have dreamed of this. They came not only materially bereft, not only materially poor, they had nothing. And it isn't just that we gain a tremendous prosperity, although that's a big deal, but they didn't speak the language, they didn't understand the culture. America was such a strange place to them. And so in 3 generations, 4 generations, it's quite remarkable to me what we have achieved, who we have become, and how this civilization, this American civilization, has shaped us. And if we understand that, then we can go ahead and understand what's changed and how it's changed and what we need to do about it. And that's going to be our plan. We're going to spend 3 sessions together talking about the remarkable civilization of American Jewish life, what happened to us here, how we ended up this way. And then a session talking about what changed on October 7th, how the world has changed. And our final session in December, we're going to put together a panel discussion of selected leaders from the community, from different aspects of American Jewish life, who can help us reflect on what now? Where do we go from here? So I went to go find someone to teach this with me because it's such an important topic. I wanted some real expertise. And I happen to know the greatest teacher in the world in this topic, the person who's written the best stuff on it, done the best thinking on this. And the good news is he happens to be my dear friend and live across the street. So please welcome Professor Stephen Windmuller. Professor Windmuller has had many different positions in the Jewish community of importance, both in scholarship and in leadership. Most recently, he's a professor in the School of Jewish Communal Service at Hebrew Union College. And then when the dean retired, they needed help. And I think now 3 times they have gone back to Steve and said, you are now the dean of the Hebrew Union College School of Communal Service. And then he became the dean of the whole college, right? And after this, he's going to become the football coach at UCLA because they discovered that this guy can do almost anything. Stephen's writing on these topics, Stephen's reflections on American Jewish life, its politics, its culture, its development, and its history is just remarkable. So I went and I begged him. I offered him all the cookies he could take home if he would come and share this class with me. So I'm really, really honored to welcome Steve and hand him the microphone. And he'll begin with us, as you can see from the video just behind me, the whole question of what was here for us when we arrived. Welcome, Steve. Thanks so much. That's mine. It's all mine. I make a mess wherever I. Here you go.
Thank you, Rabbi Feinstein, and thank you, Ilana, and good evening. So Rabbi Feinstein spoke on this topic on Rosh Hashanah, and some of you hopefully had that occasion to hear him. And he began with an extraordinary story that dealt with a film, A Wonderful Life. And he framed that as the sort of central principle or point of the American experience. And in doing so, he shaped a storyline that was powerful, informative, and reflective of this moment, the changes, as he's just noted, that we are living with. Rabbi Feinstein's family is from Eastern Europe, has arrived here in 1904 to 1914, and my parents arrived in 1938 from Germany. So we are 2 parts of the extraordinary story of the American experience. And we're going to take a look at some of the ingredients that have really built and helped frame this extraordinary community. Jonathan Sarna and Hasia Dine are two of the great historians of American Judaism and American Jewish life. In 2004, on the occasion of the 250th anniversary of the American experience, developed their extraordinary books that reflect on this history of our sojourn in America. The Jewish contract with America is fundamentally the notion that we have figured out a way to meld, integrate, and become part of this great story. So let's begin a journey here that takes a look more deeply at this contract. The contract begins with Peter Stuyvesant. The year is 1654, the arrival of the first group of Jews who come to us from Brazil, from Recife, Brazil, via Portugal and Spain, and who are part of the escape during the Inquisition, seeking a home and a place. But Stuyvesant would have none of it. He writes to the Dutch West India Company in Amsterdam, and they respond to him because he is saying, I don't want these people. And they require of him that he provide for them that they may travel and trade to and in New Netherlands and live and remain there. And this is the key. Provided the poor among them shall not become a burden to the company or to the community, but be supported by their own nation. That is the Stuyvesant doctrine, and it has been the core of the American Jewish experience. Jews have cared for themselves, cared for one another since 1654. And that is core to the arrival, development, and nurturing of such institutions as Jewish Free Loan, Jewish Family Services, and hosts of other social and humanitarian services that have defined the American Jewish experience. In 1790, as we know, George Washington is formally elected to the presidency of the United States. And the Jewish communities, and there were 6 of them, could not agree on one letter. What's new about that? So each of them wrote letters of Mazel Tov. But the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island, letter is responded by President Washington. And in his response, the president writes, "For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens." And that becomes the second principle, the sort of contractual notion that all we are expected to do is to certainly abide by, live by, and work by the principles, laws, and rules of a society. And in turn, that society will protect, defend, and secure for us our liberties and rights. The extraordinary piece of this story, besides this letter, is Washington had just completed the Revolutionary War. And there were 2,000 Jews in this country at the time of the Revolution. And 170 fought in the Revolutionary War for Washington. The first casualty of the American Revolution was Francis Salvador of South Carolina, a Sephardic Jew who was a member of the South Carolina Congress or Parliament or legislature of the time. And it's an extraordinary expression of the fact that from the beginning, Americans would be part of the military. And that's going to be a really interesting theme which we will pick up later. But the most extraordinary part of this conflict was that American Jewish individuals not only fought for the revolution, but invested in it. Now, you all know the Chaim Solomon stories, but there are many more Chaim Solomons. There's Aaron Lopez of Rhode Island, who gave extraordinary sums in support for our Navy, our small Navy. And there were many others. American Jewish investors literally invested in the military, in buying arms from France and in securing assistance from other countries. Much of those items were stored in it's one of the islands in the Bahamas and in the Caribbean, and Saint Eustatius, And Saint Eustatius was the warehouse and gathering point for all of this military. And the decision of the British military was to divide. Cornwallis would go to Yorktown, and Admiral Rodney would go to St. Eustace to take care of destroying the military hardware that was invested there. When Rodney got there, he was so infuriated by the fact that these Jewish investors had provided so much assistance to the struggling American military initiative that he literally destroyed the Jewish homes and the Jewish cemetery and stayed on to complete that task, and thereby failed to show up in Yorktown to assist Cornwallis, allowing George Washington to complete successfully the military campaign to end the Revolutionary War. Now, that story you haven't heard in many places, but that is a piece of this extraordinary contractual development of the American experience. Well, there is early anti-Semitism. It is not severe or significant, but Washington receives letters, and others in the United States government do. And this is one example that was sent to Washington early in his presidency. We explain in the language of King David, "Rid us from the hand of the stranger, whose mouth speaketh vanity, and whose right hand is the right hand of falsehood." So these are code words for get rid of the Jews. But it is a sort of early expression and statement from the beginnings of the American experience that there would be threats or challenges to our community, which of course we will come back to over the course of our 5-week conversation. I think there are pieces to the American contract that I think are particularly important, and certainly the First Amendment. We all know it: the freedom of assembly, the freedom of speech, the freedom to petition the government, and of course, the principles associated with the separation of religion and state. These are powerful because, along with Article 6 of the Constitution, which refers specifically that there shall be no religious test to anyone seeking office as part of the United States of America. Now, that was fine on the federal level, but that did not necessarily work on the state level. In 2 states, Maryland and New Hampshire, were very late in coming on board in terms of accepting Jews in public positions. The Jews Bill from 1815 in Maryland was an effort to create the opportunity for Jews to be able to serve in the Maryland state legislature. And the challenge there was that if a Jewish person is elected, he or she, of course in those days he, would be required to take the oath of office on a Christian Bible. So the elected officials, Jewish candidates who are winning, were unable to serve because they would refuse to take that pledge on a Christian Bible. So by the year 1825, Maryland would remove that limitation and allow for Jews to be fully embedded in the political process. It took till 1877 for New Hampshire to allow for Jewish participation in the public square of community service or government action. So when building a contract, we look at a number of things. And what we see here is certainly no religious test. certainly on the federal level, and no historic basis for state-sponsored anti-Semitism. Now, we'll come back to two examples where that becomes challenging and problematic, but overall, the history of the United States has not shown a particular pattern by which the government itself has introduced or imposed any type of anti-Semitic legislation, practice, or action against Jews. And the other pieces here are very important. Voluntarism was a unique American phenomenon. And Americans volunteer, as you know, in all different kinds of ways, and that's a powerfully different model than we see anywhere else in the world, that the level and the character of voluntarism is a powerful way for people to meet people, for people to be connected, and that served and continues to serve as an important ingredient in the American story. And certainly the separation of powers. That we know from our civics course, because that's important in government to protect the citizen, to advance and make sure that laws are both enforced and practiced according to the actions taken by the legislature. And in a federated system of governance, power is certainly divided, federal, state, and local. And what we're going to see is that the American Jewish community found that so attractive and so enticing that American Jewish life is literally organized using this federated concept, which we'll show you in a few moments. I'm going to introduce you here to Mordecai Noah. He is one of the most fascinating people of the 19th century. He was a friend to President James Monroe. He was known to Thomas Jefferson. His role is really quite significant. In 1825, now that's almost 75 years before the Zionist Congress and the gatherings by Herzl and others, but it was Noah's notion that America was the new Zion, and he was calling for Jews across the globe to come to Ararat. Now, where is Ararat? If you haven't been to Buffalo, well, I'm not sure you want to go to Buffalo, but if you haven't been to Buffalo, outside of Buffalo is an island called Grand Island, New York, and that was Ararat. And there is a sign to this day that speaks about Mordecai Noah's call to the Jews of the world to come and settle in Ararat. So the Zionist idea is that America is the new Zion. And by the way, the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, see this as their sort of role in American religious life and culture. They see Salt Lake City as the new Jerusalem. And as you well know, in the construct of building this nation, every major state in the Union have at least one or more cities that take on the biblical names, and those are sort of reflected in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, or Jericho, New York, or just think of it, all of the terms and ideas of Zion have been transmitted and translated into an American context. So we're going to come to one of those moments not so happy. It is 1862, and Ulysses S. Grant is the general serving the Union Army. And he wants removed from all of the Tennessee River Valley the peddlers, and most of those peddlers were Jewish, doing their business along the Mississippi River from Memphis south to New Orleans. And order number 11 would simply have removed all of them. Well, American Jewish leadership would organize, and it would be the first type of organizing we would see as a community. And they would go to Lincoln and say, this is problematic. You're singling out a group of people by identifying them as Jewish. And this is problematic to their well-being and to their concerns about being part of this nation. Lincoln orders the rescinding of this order, which is done in February of 1863. Lincoln introduces to the Congress a bill. It's called the Chaplains Bill, because he wants the Union Army to have chaplains. But the bill is worded in the following way: that all the soldiers shall be served by Christian chaplains. And the Board of Jewish Deputies of American Jewish Israelites, and we were called Israelites in the 19th century, and we were also called Hebrews. We were not actually labeled Jews per se. And this bill is introduced, and the Board of Jewish Leadership asks again of the Congress, is it possible that all religious communities can be represented? And the bill is rewritten to reflect the diversity of that theme. In the Civil War, 10,000 men contributed to that war, 7,000 on the Union side and 3,000 on the Confederate side. Now, I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. So I can tell you that this war has lived on well beyond its years. And in our synagogue in Richmond, Judah P. Benjamin, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of War for the Confederacy, would pray. And he would become the kind of symbol of the South and the role that Jews who seriously believed in the cause of the South would play. But there would be hundreds of men serving, as we know, in the Union Army on behalf of the right to change the society and move it from slavery to a position in which all men would be seen and created and understood as equal. And by the way, the issue of race is a powerful thematic issue throughout this nation's history, as we know. And we need to sort of continue to grapple with that as we understand the evolution of this story and the contract itself, because Jews are caught up in this issue on both sides of it. There was a significant amount of anti-immigrant feeling in the United States. And in the 1840s, all the way through to the 1870s and beyond, we would see the Know Nothing Party, a party that believed that this nation should not admit Catholics, God forbid Jews, but other groups that were seen as sort of not truly American. So we would begin to see that play out after the Civil War in the context of the rise of the Klan. So racism becomes a theme and a principle here that we need to fully understand as part of 19th century history and evolution. Mark Twain questioned whether Jews were loyal to America, and the Jewish community was very responsive to that question, because they demonstrated at every war, at every time, the numbers of men and women who would serve. In the Second World War, the Jewish community provided 500,000 men and women to the American case, to the American cause. And 52,000 of that 500,000 would be recipients of awards and honors for their bravery and service. And thousands, of course, would be killed, and many more wounded and injured. So that there's this constant referral to war and history as a way of demonstrating loyalty and patriotism. In Vietnam, we saw significant numbers of American soldiers of our community participating. We would see something on the order of 30,000 American Jews active in the Vietnam campaign. And what has been extraordinary is that we write these histories about Jewish military participation because it's one of the key ingredients of how a people, a community, demonstrates patriotism and loyalty. The second, of course, is our commitment to being active politically. So we have produced, since 1845, some 217 members in the House of Representatives. Kind of extraordinary numbers for a small community. Currently, there are 27 members of the House, 25 Democrats, 2 Republicans, who are serving as part of the 435 who sit in that chamber. And in the Senate, 10% of the Senate is currently Jewish. There have been 8 United States Supreme Court justices who have served, who have been part of our community. So this notion of service in government and service in military are ingredients of this sense of civic connection and engagement. And the support of institutions. That's both philanthropic, it's voluntaristic, it's associated with the notion of communal service, of giving back and embracing our communities. And that too has been a powerful sort of measure or expression of how we have been engaged. Is there a Jewish vote? Well, in 1860s, in fact, in the 1864 presidential election, President Lincoln had been informed that there was, in fact, a Jewish vote for him. And the Board of Jewish Deputies were very concerned that that was a misrepresentation, that Jews did not have a particular political candidate or cause, and wanted to make very clear to Lincoln by this letter to him that they were certainly very much a community divided and of multiple viewpoints. Assuring you, there is no necessity for pledging the Jewish vote, which does not exist, but at the same time that the majority of Israelite citizens must concur in attachment to the Union and a determination to leave no means untried to maintain its honor and its integrity. So here again, in an effort to demonstrate that Jews are part of the society but not separate from or distinctive to the society, this was a statement of principle. And no better example of this sense of loyalty, of engagement, was, of course, the efforts by Emma Lazarus in the New Colossus, which, of course, is part of the Statue of Liberty. And the statement on that statue, which, of course, in all of its beauty, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuge of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. But one of many expressions by poets and writers and songwriters to frame the message of what America would mean. Irving Berlin as being amongst the best examples. But we will go deeper into that in the weeks to come when we talk more about specific actors and actions that reference this sort of sense of loyalty and connection and engagement with the United States. Now, I mentioned at the outset that Jews were infatuated with the notion of the separation of powers, the federated system of governance. And this is what actually takes place. Because in the 1880s and 1890s, as millions of new Jews would come here from Eastern Europe, reminding ourselves Sephardic Jews first, German Jews later, and then this wave that would be extraordinary, would require a whole system of Jewish governance and practice. So we create two systems. And by the way, it's often referred to as church and state, because the denominations were our religious response to America. And our federated or social service model was our sort of civic response to America. So we create these two systems. And for 100+ years, they have been extraordinary. So you'll note that I date them till 1985, and that will be a subject for another time. But the fact is, of course, they continue, but their strength was for that first 100 years. And these two systems are really fascinating because they are parallel to one another, but they are driven by different expectations and by very different reasons for their founding. The federated system draws from the United Way. It looked at Protestant and American civic society and saw the development of this thing called collective giving, the community fund, and United Way, which is the modern outcome of that, was the model for the federated system. It's an integrated system with governance and connections between all of the core social service players. It's consensus-driven, it has a shared agenda, and it's very much directed to very specific causes and purposes. And often we see interlocking directorships, meaning people who are on the board of one group are active in another or give to that other group. So the relationships amongst this system was tight and essential in achieving its goals. Denominationalism, on the other hand, is taken from the Protestant world of America. The Protestants had divided by different church communities, and that construct would be adopted by the Reform movement, and later the Conservative movement, then the Orthodox community, and finally the Reconstructionists. And that would become part of the second orbit of creating a religious voice for American Jews that was constructed beginning in the 1870s, because that is the explosion of American religious renewal and revival after the Civil War. The extraordinary events of the Civil War create a new patriotism and a new religious revivalism in America. One occurs in the 1820s, the second in the 1870s, and a third at the time of the conclusion of the Second World War. And these are the features to how we create a denominational system. These are systems by which we could frame particular leaders who represented ideas and institutions that modeled a particular kind of religious behavior and an outlook on America as well that was distinctive to their movements and reflective of the ideas of their leaders. These movements, both of them, denominational and federation, would really drive the American story for that 100-year period. So, just to remind ourselves, America has grown tremendously. Today, not shown on this chart, we're about 7.5 million American Jews. Now that's based on the number of households. It's tied to the number of people living in Jewish households. So possibly that number is better reflected in a figure of 5,500,000 Jews who are Jews by birth, and an additional 1.5 million Jews who are either Jews by conversion, by choice, or simply living in a Jewish environment even if they've not formally become themselves Jewish. But the American Jewish community is the epitome today of the largest diaspora community we have in the world. Is the central point of so much of what is happening and has happened, of course, in our history in terms of Jewish life. And here in Los Angeles, as reflected here as well by the numbers of 170 Jews here in this town in 1850, and now we believe, based on the most recent Federation survey, of a Jewish community well over 700,000. So this is a robust community with literally a very diverse populations, because we're no longer simply Ashkenazic and Sephardic, but now Mizrahi. And also we carry and represent the fullness of the great diversity of America, which has fundamentally changed our community. Communities that are much more reflective of the new realities of a society that has gone through so many different social transformations. The bottom line here is that there's become a blend between what we see as our Jewishness and our Americanism. And these two themes integrate very wholeheartedly. The picture on this slide is taken from the chapel at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And notice, it is an American flag, and over it is is the embedded Ten Commandments, simply to show that as early as 1875, when the college was founded in Cincinnati, that this idea of Americanism and Judaism as sort of linked together was profoundly important. And I think that underscores this idea that we are often seeing ourselves and others think of us and think of America as the new Zion, which I referenced earlier. We also are deeply engaged politically, because that was a capacity we could do. That was the ability and opportunity given to us. Now, you may or may not find this of interest, but it's a series of periods in which our politics have changed, and we don't need to go into that tonight. But the point being that we have moved from simply being petitioners and sort of passive to the political process to having become central to it in the periods of the 1967 to 1985 era, in which we became part of what our teacher, Jonathan Wucher, would call the civil religion of American Jews, where we really saw the opportunity to bring Jews to freedom, to secure Israel, to recall and remember the Shoah, to deal with the opportunities of really securing for ourselves and for our fellow Jews opportunities that had never been imagined or could have been thought about. But since 1985, we began to see certain challenges. And over the course of our sessions together, we will be looking at numbers of those challenges and what they may mean for us as we move forward into a time and place that may be very different from where we have been. In our time together, Rabbi Feinstein and I will be spending a good deal of time looking at the contributions and the roles and the intensities of the ways by which American Jews have participated through literature, culture, music, the arts, and Hollywood, but also through the ideas generated in sociology, political science, the physics and science, social sciences, and the important roles that Jews have played in so many different disciplines in the American story, including, of course, business and labor. So there are some questions that grow out of all of this. Are we white? Maybe we're not quite white. Rabbi Feinstein referred to some of that in his High Holiday sermon, but the importance here is that for the first time, the far right and the far left are beginning to question our status and standing. The far right speaks to us about Jews will not replace us. Those are the words they used in Charlottesville. The far left on our university campuses and elsewhere are telling our younger Jewish kids that they are Zionists and that they are white, and they are, by their new labels, by these labels, no longer minority, but powerful, elitist, and racist. So the issue of whiteness has become extraordinarily significant. It is a test about where we stand in this society and how we are seen. And then there's the issue of our historic role as people in the middle. And sociologists have often studied this question of groups that sit in the middle, who are power brokers, who are money lenders, who are influencers, who are innovators, but nonetheless sit politically and socially and economically in a kind of middle place in a society. And that will be a challenge in terms of whether or not that has been our role, whether that role is changing, and whether we no longer sort of define ourselves or are even understood to be part of that middle frame. But we are also often seen as exemplars. The most extraordinary case were the Grandees, the early Sephardic leaders who were extraordinarily influential, or later other groups of Jewish leaders who would have profound impact on American society. And how do we sort of see these elites in relationship to both ourselves, but also to the broader society? And is that good for us? Or is that problematic for our standing in a society that is undergoing such radical change? Some of us have spoken about the fact that we were Stadtland, or that we had people of influence. Henry Kissinger was perceived as a person of influence, and huge numbers of others in the history of the American Jewish experience have held such a role. The question of that power broker role is very significant in understanding whether or not we still will hold that kind of place in this society. As we change leaders, as we are in new generations, as our numbers shift, as we become a smaller part of the American story, all of that is radically changing. But we also know that minorities are high achievers, and they want to prove themselves, and especially communities that are new minorities. Older minorities are more settled, more secure, more sense of home, but those emerging into a society are often people trying to make a statement. We belong here, and we have something to contribute here. So these are challenging issues, and challenging for us because of the vast amount of changes we see happening in this country. And the biggest change we are experiencing is trust. And that will seed a lot of our conversation over these weeks. From 1970 forward, political scientists are telling us that Americans have lost trust in the institutions of the presidency, the Congress, the courts, religion, business, and cultural institutions. And when a society loses trust, minorities in particular are threatened, because we have been buyers of that trust. We are investors in the American experience. And that has been our sort of saving grace, that we were part of the glue that held this country together. And when the trust factor becomes less so, less real, it is profoundly challenging and potentially dangerous. I think the story of American Jewry is also about how we have adapted. And over our time together, we'll talk about suburbanization of the American Jewish community, about the ideas of our being Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish in a kind of multicultural frame, and how that may be challenged today by the rise of other religious faith communities, and what that will do to the sort of status of Jews as part of the tripartite framework. Because by the year 2050, Muslim Americans will replace us as the third major religious community in this society. We lived through a period of quotas, and we saw the end of those quotas. We lived through a period in which the state of Israel was an idea only to then become the great reality, and how we were able as a society and as a community to bring this issue front and center for America in a very special U.S.-Israel relationship. But that too is being threatened in this moment. 1967 was that exact moment. As Rabbi Feinstein spoke about on Rosh Hashanah, the distinctiveness of what 67 has meant to American Jews. And the civil religion of American Jews itself is undergoing tremendous change, because we don't share necessarily today the commonalities, the shared agendas, the same points of view about who we are, what our future should be, and where we should be tied together. But we've experienced some extraordinary victories in this last 75 to 100 years. The bringing of Soviet Jews to freedom literally ended the Cold War. It was part of the extraordinary story of what occurs in 1989, as the wall comes tumbling down in Berlin, and as Jews flock to new opportunities both in Israel, here in North America, and elsewhere. So the period in which we have just lived and experienced our lives as post-war Americans from 1945 forward is really the most incredible period to study and to monitor, because in so many different ways it has both made us who we are and is now testing us as never before. I think American Jewry and the contract with America is about the fact that we've always seen tradition rather than ideologies drive us. A kind of belief system in who we are as a people and what our tradition has to say, rather than a fixed notion of a set of ideas about finding ourselves in a particular place and time. And our emphasis on federalism rather than centralism has allowed us to sort of flourish with creativity and diversity. And our idea that we always focused on the messianic, on the idea it will be better tomorrow, that we can create something better for the society and the world and for ourselves, than a kind of fatalism that others might have suggested. So it is tradition, and it is messianism, and it is federalism that I think are driving factors in creating a contract that will allow us to flourish and will, as we now know, is challenging us to rethink our place in a very rich but very diverse American story in the 21st century. Thank you.
I want to add one element to Professor Windmueller's outstanding presentation, and it's something that I made mention of in the talk I gave on Rosh Hashanah. I so appreciate that you paid such good attention to it. Not used to that, actually. When the Newport, Rhode Island congregation wrote that letter to the new president, George Washington, he was elected in 1789. He was inaugurated in 1790, and the community wrote him a letter. They were European immigrants, principally from Central Europe. Some were Sephardic, some were German, and they were used to the fact that in those societies, the Jewish community, whenever a new king was crowned, the Jewish community would send them a letter. And that letter had a format. It promised loyalty. It begged the monarch for forbearance and tolerance. And they wrote him that kind of letter. They addressed him as if he were the king of America, not the president. And principally, they saw themselves, in the letter, they expressed the fact that he is America, and they were just visitors. And the tone of his response is remarkable, because the response comes back, and basically what he says in the response is not only the words that Professor Windmueller just wrote for us, but what he says to them is, why are you asking me for anything? Why are you asking me for tolerance? You are Americans. You are as American as I am. You belong here, and this place belongs to you. And he basically rejects that whole ethos that he is the American and they're just visitors. And he says to them, you belong here and this country belongs to you. And that idea is so important to a very deep concept of what makes America, America for American Jews. And I mentioned this in the talk. In Europe, up until this day, by the way, up until this day, you are not a citizen of the country you're born in. You're only a citizen if you are ethnically and culturally of that place. I remember there was a big controversy in Germany. Following the war in Germany, Germany had no men left because they'd all died in the war. Many of them died in the war. So the Germans imported foreign workers principally Turks, people from Turkey, right? I visited Germany right after the wall fell. I was there in 1990 for an academic conference, and there was a huge demonstration because there were people in Germany who had lived there for 3 generations and were not citizens. They were the children and grandchildren of Turkish immigrants. But they didn't speak German. They spoke German in school and on the street, but at home they spoke Turkish, and they practiced their religion from, usually they were Muslims, and they were not ethnically German, and the German state did not afford them citizenship. They had certain rights, like green cards, we would call them, and the whole question was, why not? They've been here now 3 generations, for God's sakes. But that was the idea. I don't know what it is today, so I can't speak about the sociology, the political sociology of Germany today, but the idea, at least in the beginning of the American experiment, was that in Germany, you had to be German to be a German. You could live there as a Jew, but only under the tolerance, that whole idea of tolerance. Tolerance means you don't really belong, but we're not going to throw you out, right? You're not part of us, but we're going to tolerate you. Jews petitioned Napoleon for tolerance in France, right? They weren't going to be Frenchmen. They were going to be Jews who happened to live among the French, right? But America was different. There was no ethnic America. We are many ethnicities. If you don't believe me, just drive down Ventura Boulevard and count the different kind of restaurants you can eat in, right? There's a Japanese restaurant next to an Israeli restaurant, next to an Indian restaurant, next to a Mexican restaurant, next to a restaurant of, now there's a Southern restaurant, from Mississippi. That's also an ethnicity. We are not an ethnicity. We have no national church. We have no national language. My wife and I sat down last night to vote. We did our ballot, right? You can get the ballot in 25 different languages. This is unheard of in any other culture, that you can vote in God knows what, Tagalog or Korean or God knows, because that doesn't exist in America. That made arriving here very strange to us. Very strange to us that we could come here and be accepted as part of this culture and be part of this culture and be accepted not as tolerated, not tolerated here, but really integrated here. And so there's a great Jewish sociologist of the last century, Charles Liebman, who said that the great dynamic of American Jewish life is integration and distinction. He thought it was intention. I think it's an opportunity that America gave us the possibility of being both integrated and distinct at the same time. You might notice that I'm speaking to you in English, that the professor and I are dressed pretty much as academic Americans, right? Right? Not business Americans, because we both like to schlump a little bit, but academic Americans. I listened to the Grateful Dead, and I was watching the World Series before I came here, and I feel thoroughly American, and at the same time, I'm distinctly Jewish. That combination of distinction and integration is really the dynamic of American Jewish identity. Now, sometimes we get it wrong, or rather not wrong, but we push it out to the edges. I have a Hasidic cousin who lives in New York. He's chosen distinctiveness over integration to a much greater degree than I have. He's a Yankees fan. So I said, Cousin Ronnie, you go to the game? Your Rebbe lets you go to the game? He says, oh yeah, the Rebbe's a big fan too. I have to tell him how the game went. I said, how do you go to the game? He says, I go to the kosher deli, I get a bag of sandwiches, they let me in with my sandwiches, right? We buy a soda at the park, and in the 7th inning, I can catch a minion on the Lodge deck during the stretch. Now that's distinction. You hear the distinction and integration there, right? And on the other side, in terms of integration, so there is an intermarriage rate of 75% among non-Orthodox Jews in America, right? Now, what? 70%. 70%, sorry. It's going to be 75 in an hour. But now, on one level, you can say that threatens our identity here. And it's true, it does, because there are all kinds of problems and issues and difficulties with that. However, for just a moment, and please don't misunderstand, I'm not advocating intermarriage, but intermarriage only happens when the majority culture accepts you as a minority and accepts you. If they didn't want you here, they wouldn't let their kids marry your kids. But the fact that they allow us into their families means that integration at the same time as being distinct. Integration and distinction are working here. And the prophet of this is a fellow that I talked about in this sermon. He's a philosopher named Horace Collin. Okay? Now, Horace Collin's a very interesting guy. Came from Germany in the 1870s, was one of very few Jews admitted to Harvard, was the first Jew to teach at Princeton. Very interesting fellow. Two things happened to Collin to shape his identity. One was that when he was at Harvard, he was invited to join a fraternity, a very, very prestigious academic fraternity. And they said, you can join as long as you give up all vestiges of your Jewishness. And he told them to basically, thank you, but no thank you. The other was that there was a famous British playwright who came to America and wrote a very, very famous play called The Melting Pot. His name was Israel Zangwill. And his idea was you come to America and you lose your Jewishness. The play, The Melting Pot, is about a Jewish boy who marries a non-Jewish girl. And what happens is you lose your Jewishness, said Zangwill, because America melts all the ethnicities into a sort of ethnic dross. Comes along Collin and says, no, it's not that way at all. In America, each of us brings his ethnicity. And by bringing our ethnicity, we contribute to what he called the symphony of civilizations that is American culture. And he was, as I said in the talk, the inventor of the hyphen. He was the one who said, there's no such thing as an American. There's an Irish American, an Italian American, an African American, a Jewish American, a Chinese American, a Korean American, a Mexican American. Because what Collin understood, and I don't mean to get political, but what Collin understood was that there's no such thing as real Americans. We're all real Americans. We've all made an accommodation where between integration and distinction from the cultures we came from and the cultures that we adopt and the kinds of cultural forms that we express here. Now that's unusual, that's amazing for America, that America expects us to be both integrated and distinct. That America expects us to be integrated and distinct. How many of you went to public school here in America? Raise your hand, good. Hands down. How many of you had to sing the dreidel song at the school Christmas pageant? There you go. Integration and how many of you had to learn all the Christmas carols, especially the ones written by Jews, right? I mean, the scandal is, that all the great Christmas carols are written by us, right? And especially the ones that don't have you-know-who in them, right? If you hear you-know-who's name, that wasn't one written by Jews, but I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas, Irving Berlin, right? Jingle Bells, Jewish, right? The Christmas song, Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire, Jewish. Jewish American songwriters created a December holiday which Jews could participate in without losing their distinctiveness. And then we had to come to the Christmas pageant and sing the dreidel song. So in addition to what Professor Windmuller has talked in terms of this contract, part of the contract was the expectation and the challenge of being both integrated and distinct. And so much of the stuff that makes us lose sleep is when we get that integration distinction thing wrong. And we worry, did I go too far one way or the other? Did I go too far one way? Am I letting my kids participate too much in the larger American culture? Should we have been more distinct? Or on the other hand, can I let go of my distinction and participate in other cultures? And this is something that we continue to negotiate. And that's one of the things I think that makes American Jewish life so interesting. We have a lot to say, as you can tell. That's why we have a 5-session course. And we're going to have a lot to learn about how Jews did it here in America. But let's stop here with this introduction. Again, I want to thank the professor. You want to add anything? Okay. Questions? This is your chance to talk. Anyone have questions, comments, counter sermons, better ideas? I think we've stumped the crowd. Yes, please. Norm. Should we use a microphone? We're going to bring you a mic. This is being recorded, and I want you recorded for posterity. Here we go. Let's share. We'll just share. Norm's in the back. Oh, here's Louise is gonna. Louise is our Vanna White.
It doesn't work.
If anybody wants to buy a vowel, just ask Louise.
Unless she carries it, it doesn't work.
Yeah, speak right into the mic, Norm.
I may be stepping out into more current times than you carried here, but was there always a premise that the Jewish state would not take a role in the American government, and America wouldn't take a stake in the Israeli government? Or is that just a fiction?
The question is that a Jewish state. Let me push a little bit. How did the advent of the state of Israel affect this whole dynamic, especially the American Jewish political participation? Give it a go.
Well, first, just to remind ourselves, I grew up, as I told you earlier, in a congregation and a community, Richmond, Virginia, which was American Council for Judaism, which meant that there would be no Israeli flag on our bima, that Hebrew was minimized, that there would be no reference to the state of Israel or to Zionism. And that was in play from 1940s till 1967. In 1967, that congregation discovered Israel, as did many American Jews. But the extraordinary piece of that experience is that I think American Jews saw Israel as a opportunity for Jews elsewhere in the world to find home, security, and an opportunity to build something that would be rather extraordinary. The United States' role would evolve. As you know, the United States was slow in formally doing a great deal on behalf of Israel's security, Israel defense. But the story of the decision by Harry Truman to recognize the state of Israel is tied to relationships. His buddy, Eddie Jacobson, as you may know this story, asked Truman to see Chaim Weizmann. Truman agrees because his buddy has asked him to do this. And in that moment, Truman is really introduced to the rationale, the reason, and the struggle for this whole idea of Jewish national statehood. If you go to the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, there's a whole section devoted to this moment, to that experience, and to that decision. It's really quite extraordinary. But it takes America, as it does many American Jews, literally 2 decades to sort of come to the reality of what this all really means and what it would represent. And in that context, the American Jewish experience has permitted us to be advocates, defenders, interpreters of Israel. And it has created this extraordinary relationship that I referenced between Washington and Jerusalem. Whether Democrat or Republican, that has been in play for these 70-odd years. And that is really the framework on which this is uncovered. My sense is that we see ourselves as defenders of Jewish history, because the state is the embodiment of the Jewish promise. And I don't know that it in any way conflicts or violates any other principle of our Americanism. In fact, I think it reinforces and supports our Americanism. As Rabbi Feinstein mentioned in his sermon, Louis Brandeis beautifully frames the connection of Zionism to American patriotism, and in a sense affords us the opportunity to be advocates, because making us better Jews, making us stronger Zionists, makes us equally engaged Americans. And in that context, I think that's really the nature of this very special and unique relationship. When I taught in China, the Chinese were so curious about diaspora and American Jews' relationship to Israel. They wanted to understand why we were so deeply embedded and connected to the Israel story, because they don't share that sense of connection to diaspora communities that they have, which is the world's largest diaspora. And they just don't have that same sort of emotional, cultural, I certainly don't have a religious connection. And that's so powerful and so significant.
We could spend a lot of time on this, but I want to just add one kind of nasty note, if it's okay. And I acknowledge that this is a little difficult to hear. I think that American Jews, by and large, especially people our age, my age, your age, our age, not younger folks. Younger folks have different sorrows. We have a deep emotional attachment to Israel. But the Israel that we have a deep emotional attachment to is a symbol. It's not the real Israel. I mean, it's amazing to me that we don't speak the language, we don't know the culture. You don't know what Israelis eat for breakfast. You don't know what books they read last year. You might know what television they watch because now it's on Netflix. You know, Fauda came here. But the fact is that we know Israel and we love Israel, but the Israel we love is a symbol. And it's loved emotionally as a symbol of something deep within us. And when our kids come to us and they say, why does this matter to you? Sounds like the kid at the Seder, right? We have a hard time explaining it. Because if you say, it's our homeland, the kid says, no, it's not. I live here. And if you say, well, yeah, but our history is there. They say, great. So it's also in New York, you know, or in Poland, for that matter. We have a hard time expressing what Israel means to us because there is a deep ambivalence, meaning we're here and we chose to live here and not go there. And by the way, the early Zionists, they didn't understand this at all. Ben-Gurion couldn't figure out why American Jews weren't packing up and moving to Israel. He literally couldn't figure it out. And the only reason he stopped telling American Jews how wrong they were for living in America was because he cut a deal with the American Jewish establishment that they would raise money for him if he would shut up. I mean, quite literally. The guy's name was Blaustein, who cut the deal with him, right? That they would stop saying you're bad Jews for living in America, and in return, we would send them millions and millions and millions of dollars. But still, it's a very interesting question of what Israel means to us if we feel so comfortable here, and how you have two centers of Jewish life in this way. So it's a very ambivalent and I think still evolving relationship. And one of the things we need to take up in our conversation over these weeks is, how did October 7th change that? Will we see? I mean, one of the interesting questions that's out there among my friends is, will we see a revival of a kind of Zionism that takes the real Israel seriously and not simply Israel as a symbol? In other words, will we learn Hebrew? Why don't American Jews speak Hebrew? Isn't that a strange thing that we don't speak Hebrew? I have friends who are Francophile. I have a friend who fell in love with France when he was a kid, speaks fluent French, speaks French, reads French, eats French food, smokes those idiot French cigars, you know? American Jews love Israel with all their heart. They don't know an olive from a shin, you know? It's just, to me, a very strange relationship. We have to explore this a little. But thank you, Norm. George, you had your hand up? Thank you for being patient. Judy, George is next. You get the one after that. Is that okay?
Sorry.
You'll have the next one.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm talking a little bit from a different point of view. And the reason, because I was born in Hungary. I do not have this history. I understand this history, but I certainly was not raised in that history. I remember one time a Hungarian famous poet was asked about anti-Semitism. And he was a Catholic Hungarian. And what his response was that, I don't have a problem with Jews as long as they adapt all my customs, all my relationship, and basically they're not Jews. They become Hungarians.
Right.
So My concern is, from this point of view, is that how the non-Jews look at this. The current environment suggests that we have a kind of a view which does not recognize the non-Jews' view, which is what happens if the United States would have a war with Israel. Which side we Jews will stand? Are we going to go to war on the American side, or we'll go to Israel? Yeah. And that, I think, that's a conflict which is kind of unsolvable.
Yeah. There's actually, if I could just comment on what you said, there's actually a deeper question. Because America doesn't have an ethnicity, because we don't have an official language, because we don't have a national church, because we don't have a head of state who's outside of our political system, right? You can't swear allegiance to the king or the queen like you do in England and do your politics separately. It has always been a question in this country, what ties us together? Politicians swear an oath to the Constitution, right? They don't swear an oath to the country because there's no such thing really as the country. And the question is what is real Americanism and what are the forces of social cohesion, the forces that hold us together? And so since the beginning of the American project, since the very beginning, there really is a question of what makes you an American, right? If you come here from a foreign country and we don't force you to learn the language, we don't force you to adopt the customs, just like your friend, the poet said. We don't force that. Quite the contrary. We encourage you to maintain your own cultural distinctiveness, then what makes you American? And therefore, that's one of the reasons why immigration has always been an issue in American culture. There's an argument between George Washington and Alexander Hamilton. Washington believed all immigrants should be welcomed lovingly. Hamilton, who himself was an immigrant, and probably Jewish, right, thought that bringing in immigrants was a bad idea because they would poison the Americanism of what's here. This beautiful poem that the professor put up on here by Emma Lazarus, there was a contrary poem printed in newspapers and magazines all over the country about closing the iron gates against foreign hordes who have come to poison the American bloodstream. We're not the first, this is not the first election to where the immigration issue is being argued over, right? It's not the first. In fact, almost every, for many, and it's interesting who played what role. Ronald Reagan was believed in open immigration. He believed we were the shining city on the hill and we should welcome everybody from all over the world. You know, other people have different ideas about what makes you an American. So it's not just Israel. It's really this question of what makes us American. The Israel question is just a compounding it because there's another country. By the way, just to give you another piece of this, so you understand Israel's not the only issue. There was a president elected in this country in 1960 named John F. Kennedy. He was the first Catholic. There was a huge question because the question was, what if the Pope tells you to do something that's against America's interests? And Kennedy gave a very famous speech in Houston where he talked about the idea that that's his faith, but his American loyalty goes deeper. But it's a big question here. So now you have a country like Israel, and the question is what if Israel does something contrary to American interests? And this last war, there's been a tremendous tension between the American administration and the Israeli administration over how the war should be conducted. The flow of weapons hasn't stopped, but at least there's been an argument going on. It's always been this question of where are your loyalties? How do you maintain social and political cohesion if people are practicing cultures which are, as it were, foreign? What is the native culture if that's foreign? These are the kinds of issues. And the Israel issue is only one among many others. You want to add something?
The most admired religious community in the United States are American Jews. Every poll confirms that. Israel remains, even despite October 7th and the war this past year, very favorable in the minds of American citizens, overwhelmingly so. Challenge certainly with younger Americans, and that we'll have to deal with. But we have to keep in mind that the Israel-American story is not the American-Jewish connection. It is an American connection. And that is really profoundly important in understanding how foreign policy and how loyalties are shaped.
The problem is you have a daughter in Berkeley. Berkeley's a foreign country. I mean, I'm very serious. The culture of the city and campus of Berkeley is a very unique culture. It's a strange culture. All right, Judy, go ahead, your turn.
Okay. So I find it interesting that both of you have said that we are American Jews, and there are those who identify as Jewish Americans.
Yeah.
And I think there's a distinct difference, and it may have started with our grandparents or parents who came here and wanted to identify as Americans. They didn't want to speak their language of their land. They wanted to be American. It was very important. And even those who might have come speaking Yiddish would throw that off because and we lost a beautiful language as a result. They didn't totally lose it, it's still there. But so I think that we have a double problem of how we identify ourselves and how we see ourselves. Are we more American than we're Jewish, or are we more Jewish than we're American, or where are we? And then we have the problem of how the outside world identifies us, which goes way back to the Torah, when we were the resident and not necessarily a citizen, you know. And where do we go with that? That's been around for thousands of years.
Stephen, you're up. Then I'll do
I mean, I think the interchange between American Jew and Jewish American also depends on the moments of when that conversation takes place, not just generationally, but also in this moment. I think a number of American Jews will tell you that their Jewishness has become very important to them because they feel in some sense threatened by the outside world. And so it evolves as a kind of interesting sort of challenge for us. At times we take great pride in our Americanism, and at other points, as with now, that we find ourselves Jewishly much more connected.
There's a context. I'll be right with you, Howard. Just 1 second. There's a context to this. My professor, when I was in seminary, was a great historian by the name of Gerson Cohen. And Gerson Cohen published a very controversial article in the early 1960s called "The Blessings of Assimilation." And he made the case, and I think it's a very compelling case, and it's very controversial, which is there's no such thing as Jewish. In any particular age, in any particular cultural context, we Jews have assimilated cultural forms from the cultures in which we live. Some of them are external and peripheral, right? My family eats gefilte fish. My Persian neighbor hates it. He eats rice, 18 different kinds of rice, right? There are deeper kinds of issues, right? Our holidays. We just had a holiday called Sukkot. Sukkot was borrowed from Canaanite fertility rites, right? There's a reason why you walk around waving these things in the air. I mean, the fact is that we have always taken cultural forms. So the question is are there core Jewish items? Yes, there are essential core Jewish items, but they have always been framed and cloaked and embraced by cultural forms from the cultures in which we live. The Judaism that we practice, as the professor pointed out, is heavily Americanized. But that's exactly what we've always done. Jews in ancient Greece, the Maccabees, for example, adopted Hellenistic ways. The Romans, we adopted the Roman legal digest and created the Talmud. Maimonides took Aristotle, converted him to Judaism, and created the Guide for the Perplexed. The 13th century mystics of the Zohar took Christian mystical ideas, including the Virgin Mary, washed all the Christianity out of it, and created Kabbalah. We've always done this. To not do it is an aberration. And even the ones who tell you, and this is what's important to say, the ones who look differently than me, who dress differently, who talk differently, whose beards are much bigger and hats are much bigger than mine. They've assimiled. Moses didn't have a shtreimel. Moses didn't speak Yiddish. Moses didn't know. That's 16th, 17th century Polish gentry. I mean, so even the ones who tell you that they're Torah true, yeah, they're Torah true, wrapped in Polish cultural forms. So, are we Jewish American, American Jews? You can't separate them. Because the Judaism we practice is heavily interpreted by the American civilization in which we live, right? Who was the first Jewish community that really, really took advantage of the internet to promulgate its Jewish ideas and learning? Chabad. Go figure. The people who tell you that they are the most Torah true Jews are also the most tech savvy. There you go. Howard.
Well, the difference in being a Jew in America today is so different for me than the way I grew up. I grew up in Chicago before Israel was a state, and I had to walk from my neighborhood through a Gentile neighborhood to go to school. And every day was a challenge. If you stayed there a little bit too late, you might get beat up. I always felt that I was a Jew living in this country, but they could always tell me, go back where you came from, and we had no place to go back. I always felt insecure. If we went to a restaurant someplace, we weren't waited on fast enough. My parents would say, because we're Jewish, they're not waiting on us. Always had that feeling. And after the state of Israel, and especially the Six-Day War, it is so much different for me, for my personal feeling, that nobody can tell me, go back where you came from, because I have a place to go back if I want to. And I can be proud of who I am. I could sit in a restaurant and let everybody know I'm Jewish. I could tell Jewish jokes. I could tell Jewish stories. And even today, with what's going on in Israel and the problems with how people feel one way about Israel, we know that we're a proud people that have a country to go to. And for me, it's a totally different feeling.
Yeah, and I think that's the idea of the evolution of our culture and the evolution of our sense of belonging in America is a very important part of this story. You know, there's a very famous story about two Jewish kids in Cleveland about your generation who got beat up. They had to walk through an Italian neighborhood on the way to Hebrew school, so they used to get beat up every time. So they sat down, and they were both good artists, and they created a character of a guy who was a mild-mannered, wimpy guy on the outside, but on the inside he had a big shin on his chest. And that's how Superman was created by two Jewish kids in Hebrew school. Because the idea was, I have to hide who I am. I am a strange visitor from a faraway planet sent here to pursue truth, justice, and the American way. And nobody knows that underneath this mild, nebbishy character lies the man of steel. That's a Jewish fantasy, but in so many ways it's also an emblem of Jewish identity.
Every major comic character of the era of Superman, all of these other characters are all Jewish modalities, all about the sense Jews have strength, Jews have power. This was a frame through which these cartoonists could articulate that in use of language that was profoundly important for us because it gave them a sense of empowerment in the 1940s and 50s. It's just an amazing story of the role that cartoons, especially these particular kinds of figures that Superman, for example, represents.
Well, I want to thank everybody for every coming. It's 9 o'clock. It's time for us to go get ice cream. And thank you to Professor Windmuller. Come back next week, same times next week. And next week we're going to talk about how we survive, what we did here. Not just survive, but how we thrived as an American Jewish culture. And then we'll go through the story of what happened on October 7th and following. But thank you for joining us tonight. Take good care. Thank you very much.